This is Theory of Change. I'm Matthew Sheffield. If you've watched or listened to this podcast for a while, you probably know by now that Theory of Change is about stories, larger trends that happen, and the narratives we tell ourselves about them. We're finite beings as humans. We exist for a moment within a small slice of space-time. To understand anything at all about externality, we have to simplify. But sometimes, simplification makes things more complicated and confusing. The historical moment in which we live is incredibly messy and confusing, which is why I firmly believe that while the 20th century was the age of the economist, the 21st century is the domain of the philosopher, an era of interpretation. And that's why I'm excited to bring you today's discussion with Virginia Heffernan. She's a really fantastic writer and thinker whose work you may have seen in the New Republic, Wired, or at her Substack, Magic and Loss. Virginia has written a lot of great journalism over the years, but at her heart, she is a literary critic, and that is a profession that I think is very well suited to interpret our interesting times, because the division between text and subtext is often impossible to delineate. I hope you'll enjoy. Theory of Change is part of the Flux Media Network, so go to flux.community for more podcasts and articles about politics, technology, media, and society, and how they all intersect and affect each other. And if you want to go to the archives of this program, just go to theoryofchange.show, where we have the video, audio, and transcript of all the episodes. And if you're interested in supporting the show on Patreon, we have free subscriptions and paid subscriptions on there as well. Just go to patreon.com/discoverflux. And if you want to do the Substack side of things, go to flux.community. And if you're watching on YouTube, please click the like and subscribe button so you can get notified whenever we post a new episode. That would be great if you can do that. All right, let's get into the program. And joining me now is Virginia Heffernan. Hey, Virginia. Hey. Welcome to Theory of Change.
I'm so glad we're doing this.
Yes, me too. Absolutely. Well, so why don't we start with that the title of your Substack is called, the subtitle of it, I should say, is called Politics for English Majors.
That's right. That's the subtitle.
What do you mean by that?
So its title is the same as my book title from 2016, Magic and Loss. And I can tell you about that title if you are interested, but essentially comes from audio engineering. That's lossy, sound representation is representation that loses something obscure from the sound that we might not be able to perceive with our ears, but that can be quantified. And that's the loss. And then the magic is sort of that term of art from tech, or a term of marketing from tech, that, any technology sufficiently advanced is indistinguishable from magic. It was a big Steve Jobs word. So the book was about the internet, was about those two sides of the internet, something obscurely lost for which we're grieving, and something gained that almost tripped our minds into kind of superstitious thinking, into magical thinking. And so that's the title of the book. That's the title of the Substack, which began a bit to be about tech, because that's what I had written about for so long. But I'm trained as a literary critic. I did a PhD at Harvard in English, and the topic of the dissertation was sort of finance and various novels about finance, and in particular about inflation. So in short, the idea that to save money is to lose it in American fiction at the turn of the 20th century. And that has all kinds of consequences for nostalgia and preciousness and money and value. So all those things were propelling this Substack as I went into to write it. And but I had also very much since 2012 been writing about tech and politics since the digital election of 2012, which I wrote about for Yahoo News, just pounding the pavement, going to the conventions, studying the Pinterest of Mitt Romney's wife, like that kind of thing. So I had my old podcast Trumpcast had just been ended because we thought Trump's reign of terror was over, right? After Trump lost the 2020 election. I looked forward to not writing about politics, to writing back about tech, because I figured the ship of state had been righted with Biden as president and that politics would become boring again, and that I'd be able to write full time about AI, which I, was writing about for Wired at the time. AI and also some biotech with Ozempic and other drugs. And I figured that would be my future. But then Trump was reelected, and so it stopped being tech and politics and wanted to be, or I felt it wanted to be politics again. But all of it, including the book Magic and Loss, all the way through, has been influenced by my training, and I can only call it that as a literary critic. I don't say that to establish my authority as much as to say that's what I was soaking in for so long. My father was a literary critic, and it's, these things are hard to get out of once you have hermeneutic strategies and methodologies. But also, a lot of politics seems to me to come down to textual analysis. So a very simple one is originalism, right? Like, it's crazy to hear people hear constitutional law people talk about originalism, or to hear religious folks talk about fundamentalism without using the tools of literary criticism. Originalism there's a lot of faith in occult processes that let you imagine that you can read words the way they are originally either intended or laid down, and this is kind of the work of literary criticism, is to understand why there's nothing simple and transparent about language that's put on a page. There's nothing that you can see through to either the intention of an author or to reality, or maybe you can, right? So that's another argument. But the fact that people have arguments about originalism absent the language of literary criticism and the methodology of literary criticism is just leaving a lot on the table. It's leaving a lot of tools on the table. And, I've seen computer scientists and other people kind of philosophers swoop in on conversations in public domains, in other domains, and say, like, what, we have something to offer here. This is Aristotle, and psychologists coming in with physicists, or, and so on. And that, I'm an academic at heart. I like interdisciplinary studies. And I think it can be very useful to use some of the techniques of literary criticism, and I can give more examples of that, to understand all kinds of facets of American politics.
Yeah, I definitely think that's right. And, and in a lot of ways, the politics of this moment, of the 21st century, I see it as that this is the century of philosophy. The 20th century was the century of economics. But and going back to philosophy as sort of the nexus of politics, that is the historical reality of it.
Yeah.
And that even, like the term economics, that comes from oikonomia, which, is the Greek word. And Aristotle was the one that put that in. So it wasn't this wasn't a discipline that arose on its own ex nihilo. It was created by philosophy, just like it created so many other things, including religion.
I really appreciate, and I agree, by the way, with the implication that literary criticism or criticism is a subset of philosophy. I double majored in philosophy and English. My problem with philosophy, and Aristotle as an example, is just that I could read so little of it in the original. Certainly not ancient philosophers, but also French philosophers and so on. So what I like about that I think some people forget when they think that what we study in English departments is literature, right? We are trying to focus on just literature in English or in the American language, and paying close attention to the way the English language works. So I have much, much less to say about Flaubert than I do about Walt Whitman, for obvious reasons. And I'm not competent to, even if I can get through a copy of Madame Bovary in French, not capable of reading it very deeply, because my vocabulary is limited, because my understanding of the grammar is limited, because I haven't been soaking in it. And I just am skeptical of the translations that I get when it comes to ancient texts. I'm not sure. You just did like a lovely translation. We had to do in the PhD program I was in. We had to have two two modern languages, and one of my ancient languages was Old English. So we can do those translations, but it's incredible how revelatory they are when you press on them and you wonder how much you might be missing. So anyway, I just emphasize that literary criticism in English and American literature is a subset of philosophy, especially since it's got this incredible laser-like focus on the English and particularly, in my case, the American language.
Yeah. Well, and it's also that, so just as much as, the spoken, so just, I guess, well, let me go back to the, further way back, if we look at Socrates as a philosopher, he explicitly said, I don't want to write anything, because to write down something means to, lose the meaning of what I was saying, and that it can be misinterpreted, that people will say that I was trying to say something when I wasn't trying to say it. But if I'm talking to them, they can be completely clear as to what my intentions were. That's obviously
that's a
true.
Great reminder. I mean, I love that. I don't know if you know Walter Ong's work, but he was, I think, a minister in one of the founders of media studies. If you take the University of Toronto with Marshall McLuhan, as the avatar of it, as the birthplace of media studies. And he contrasted the oral and written traditions in a somewhat similar way, to say that there's something that written language always ends with QED. It's like, I'm going to close the case. I'm not listening. I'm not, and I can do this as a compulsive filibusterer. I can shut out the other person so that I can make my point. But that is in dialogue, not what conversation with other people exists to do. And very few people are talking aloud in a room, where most writers are just writing in a room. And making meaning together, as Socrates did in dialogue, is maybe the only way to really extend your thinking on a matter. I think David Graeber and David Wengrow, who wrote The Dawn of Everything together, in that book, they talk about how there's some neuroscience, and I'm not going to get it right, but that says we can only hold a thought in our brain for a certain number of seconds. But
the working memory, as it's called.
Working memory, right? But in conversation, we could hold a thought forever. We could you and I could probably go for hours here. And
we could.
And even
we won't do that, guys.
We won't do that. We'll spare you our mutual filibuster. But but anyway, so I think I think that point about spoken language is absolutely right. I think that literary critics see themselves as in some kind of dialogue with another text, and that's the way we get around the idea that we're just writing in our own heads. There's something incredibly intimate about reading, about close readings. You can almost begin to imagine the author has an infinite number of choices about what next word to use, and you're on a precipice in the spaces between words of what's going to happen next. And when you can start to make guesses about what it might be, or sort of understand why that word was chosen, it's almost like riding the rails of someone's very nervous system, and that is, I think, a kind of intimacy that is like a Socratic dialogue.
This is so relevant now because we're in this historical moment for humanity in which, there is a minority of people who do believe in the scientific method and what it means and apply it to their own lives. But we're the minority, and we have always been the minority. And yet excuse me, and yet the that minority has always operated as if it was the majority.
Yes, right.
Because it has a more functional and an epistemic process in which can layer upon itself, ad infinitum.
Yeah.
It supposes that everyone else agrees with that, but in fact, the majority of people don't agree with it and probably have never really fully understood it.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not sure. So, what do you mean by scientific method?
Well, I just mean the idea that, that we can improve our understanding of reality by observing it and then creating hypotheses about how certain aspects of it function.
Right.
And then testing those hypotheses, and then if they're not true, then we abandon those hypotheses. So it's about continually falsifying our ideas and being open to the idea that nothing is always true, or is indubitably true, as Karl Popper had said, very convincingly with regard to science. But that applies beyond science, that you have to keep an openness to revising your priors, as people sometimes say.
I just want, for listeners, it seems important to flag maybe where our opinions diverge. And you can probably imagine that as someone who was was woken out of my own dogmatic slumbers by a philosopher. I started doing analytic philosophy when I was in college at the University of Virginia, and then the University of Virginia hired Richard Rorty, a philosopher, but he refused to be in the philosophy department because he was had written his way out of philosophy, and in particular analytic philosophy. First, he had been enchanted by continental philosophers, including Derrida, including some of the ones most loathed by analytic philosophers, and then had started to think that he mostly wanted to be a literary critic and for various reasons. And so he started the Department of the Humanities, and by that point, I was exhausted by A.J. Ayer and by sense data and little pennies that looked like an ellipse and what we could do if there were actually datum that floated before our eyes. I don't want to reduce analytic philosophy to just that, but there was some strange stuff going around that seemed to be taking me down a path I didn't know. And because I was much more drawn to poetry than science, for many, many contingent reasons, came to believe that poetry had greater explanatory power for me than scientific method. So I wouldn't want to say that it's the tools of literary criticism that interest me more than the tools of science.
Sure, yeah. But I'm just saying overall, you understand that your personal beliefs are not the absolute truth.
Oh, absolutely. I would say You're right, even more than science. So both of us in that way are absolutely Socratic. What I'm testing those beliefs against is an absolute conviction in my own, lack of wisdom, that my own inability to perceive the world as it is, and also ultimately my it's like we must imagine the ignorant person happy, or the person seeking meaning happy, in the sense of that quest for a way to describe the world such that it crystallizes my sense of identity, and then a way to describe the world such that it describes a just possibilities, or how to improve the world and reduce suffering in the world. Those two different private-public projects are a reason to seek some durable modes of expression. This is all quite sounds boring or circumlocutus, as opposed to scientific language, which sounds much more direct. But I'm just a little bit afraid of, there are ways of, testing our delusions against reality, or, falsifying beliefs, or even settling on, absolutely true statements instead of useful and beautiful statements, as pragmatists believe, pragmatists describe that.
Well, yeah, except, I mean, Popper explicitly said that the scientific truths, so-called, are actually just unfalsified beliefs.
Yeah.
That's all they are.
Yeah.
So that's, I think we actually agree on it. We're just putting it in different
Yes,
light.
I think we do. And I think I really like learning that you sort of live in the flicker among these various disciplines, the way that I do, because, we're probably
We
not,
need more of that,
we need more of that. And
I think.
also, it was just a very exciting time to come of age, like as, young philosophers. There was just a lot to, at least it seemed exciting to me, to have various philosophers kind of bringing us closer to scientific method, and also because I wasn't an economist at the time, so we had a lot of space to ourselves. People were less bothered by people doing philosophy and criticism, because economists were competing for these much more highly paid jobs, and also paving a way for them to go into finance, which was not a pathway open to English and philosophy majors.
Yeah, well, and the other reason, though, just to go back to something that I had said about, that this is the time of philosophy versus the time of economics, is that, the end of the Cold War showed that Marxism was not, it was not a possible destination. It wasn't going to work. But then the intervening years since then have shown that pure capitalism doesn't work. And that, and Peter Thiel, the uber advocate of capitalism, explicitly says, in his view, capitalism is about the creation of monopoly. And so it is not about competition. In fact, competition is bad. If you're a capitalist, you want to have no competition.
Yes.
Right. And so in that sense, events have made economics obsolete, in that pure communism, pure capitalism, nobody wants those, and they don't function.
Yeah.
And you can't even get to them, in fact.
Yes.
But even if you could, it would be destructive all around.
I just published a piece in the New Republic about the Big Ten conference. The Big Ten conference in the United States, I'm sure most people know this, now includes 18 schools across 16 states. So there's nothing 10 about it, but incredibly powerful organization writing about it, and writing about the capacities to oppose Trump and fight back against federal overreach and the federal government. I discovered that it was founded by an education reformer who also happens to be the inventor of the game of American football. And just I'll speed past some of this history, though it's very interesting, is that the president of Harvard, the notorious racist Charles Eliot, was against football because he thought it was brutal, that there was deception in it, and that it shouldn't be, and he was against intercollegiate football because students shouldn't be performing to entertain other people. That's not what education was. And Camp thought otherwise. He also ran a factory. He believed that, students should be taking orders, and they should be able to be part of a team, and then they should rise up until they can give orders themselves. So it's a very coach-driven way of thinking about, coach-driven and unified executive, a sort of presence that orders us into what to do. We take orders, and then ultimately we give orders. Now, it sounds like one is somewhat dehumanizing and the other isn't, but one thing the Big Ten understood is that nobody, just to put it quickly, I mean, Eliot loved competition, right? But William Camp's point is that nobody likes competition. Everybody likes winning, to your point, right? So it's not just that you want competition, you want a monopoly. And I think that goes to your idea that, competition for its own sake, where not everyone is out for a monopoly, simply makes no sense. There's no way that people in a gentlemanly way, even in the sort of Oxford system, are going to, throw the game of Quidditch at the end in order to what, right? It's not they want a fair game, but more than a fair game, they want to win. And I think that was actually a very crucial insight of Camp's. And now the Big Ten, while Harvard dithers around with prestige and backroom compromise and all this other small stuff, the Big Ten is still devoted to building up the most nuclear reactors of any university conference in the world, to beating Europe in quantum, to winning at football, to making 1.4 billion in untaxed revenue a year. And this thing is hiding in plain sight because it wants to win. It's not in the business of pretending to be pro-capitalism. It's just trying to nail its incredible scientific accomplishments and build up its resources. And in some ways, I feel like it's the reason that you can have so many Marxists there is that there's no one arguing for capitalism. There's just people making things, that are better than other people's things.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's also that it's they have a vision of public education for the public,
absolutely,
and
absolutely.
as an integral part to the states and localities in which they exist.
That's right.
And that does not exist for the Ivy League.
That's right. And where Harvard has little interaction with the governor of Massachusetts, although she's a Harvard alumna, those schools are integral to their state's economies, like the number 4, number 3 employers in their states. And often they have former governors, or at least in 2 cases, former governors come and take over as presidents. The governors they really like it if they went to Purdue or IU or Ohio State, and they have 44 million fans, the Big Ten schools altogether. These are schools that people don't have contempt for like they do for Harvard and Yale. They have an allegiance to, and that allegiance is more strong and immediate than their allegiance to MAGA, for instance, no matter where they fall on the political spectrum. So I think there's a lot going right at the Big Ten, but the other thing I wanted to say is it's sort of outside that particular conversation about economics because, they just are blissfully striving for monopolies on things that people should be pursuing monopolies on. I mean, they ultimately are open source, right? Because they're public. But on medical research, they do collaborate, of course, with China on medical research, on green tech, on nuclear power, because capitalism, is secondary to arriving at answers, and being the first to arrive at answers. So, I mean,
yeah.
You don't want science and progress without people out for monopolies. You want people who want to get there first.
The other thing also that I think is illustrative about the Big Ten versus the Ivy League is that it is the relationship to, and you've talked about it a bit here, but, just like the relationship to capital. That these schools do have large public funding, and because they're so integral to their states, it's a lot harder for the Republicans in their state to slash them.
Although that has happened at Indiana University. Yeah, you've probably seen that.
Yes, unfortunately,
the humanities have basically been obliterated there. But
yeah,
yeah.
Well, I was going to say, but the other thing that is different is that because the Ivies are mostly private. They do, have to be going out and raising money a lot more. And one of the people who had very many connections to these schools was Jeffrey Epstein. And Epstein has since gone on to become, kind of a figure that, as we were talking about before the recording here, that, I think I correctly identified him as somebody who can be the representation of the corrupt bargain that is at the heart of modern institutions in a way that is easy for people to grasp, no matter their ideology or how much
that's right
informed they are or not.
So, well, I'll try to. I as you know, I ended up in a circle of people called edgies. That was some people, I've been on podcasts to talk about it as a cult, But let's just say it had some cult-like qualities to it. But the worst thing about it was not that it was that it was sponsored by Jeffrey Epstein. I didn't know who Jeffrey Epstein was at the time, and honestly didn't even know the name of the person that gave most of the money for it. But we can talk about it in a second. But what this organization or group did is end up and this is what I hated most about it, was produce so much sophistry. So you can lay at its feet things like evolutionary psychology and certain kinds of neuroscience and certain kinds of bad philosophy, and also in addition to intellectual fraudulence and a lot of people missing the mark of the what's it called, the replicability crisis, right? Like whose studies couldn't be replicated. Um, they also were exerting great dominance over people who worked for them to the point of lots of sexual abuse. And so that combination of things, headquartered at places like Harvard and MIT, where Jeffrey Epstein supposedly smartwashed, or whatever, some version of smartwashed his money, plowing it into eugenicist adjacent departments and faculty, and having these people to his house and all that stuff, produced sophistry, produced this kind of sexual abuse. And I can just name one after another. This isn't QAnon, right? This is like actually arrested, documented court documents. Same with Epstein. That same thing that I was to some extent complicit in, and lots of people in the academy, in retail, in all these, Victoria's Secret, if you were interested in modeling, in New York real estate, if you were in Hollywood, where Kevin Spacey and other celebrities flew with and hung out with Epstein. Then the arts, so Interlochen is another place, like an arts and acting school in where he recruited. So these are so many domains that Epstein touched. If you were anywhere near them, you had a creeping feeling that somehow the person that you were was being compromised, that you were sitting talking to a seemingly interesting person at a party, and then his girlfriend came up and she looked like she was 15. That happened, and you just didn't say anything about it. I would tell myself everybody was getting a deal out of it, and this is where I think conservatives, I might have listened to conservatives. My full-throated defense of Bill Clinton for having, getting a blowjob in the Oval Office was very like, oh, we're also, I call this sort of a swanky leftism. Mitterrand has 3 families, and it's all the greatest thing in the world you can do to not be puritanical, right, and American. And Jeffrey Epstein was that too. I did not know that he was trafficking women. Obviously, I never even saw him at a party, but I saw Donald Trump and Melania, and we're accepting what, like 30-year age difference is just a kind of normal thing, right? It's like the thing we deplore in Mormons was the thing that we thought was like really exciting and sophisticated and really like comme il faut with intellectuals and with the rich. So those two things, my proximity to it, then the distance of other people from it, who must have thought seeing movies like Miramax movies that had, all kinds of like outlandish, abusive, cruel sexuality represented, had really weird codes of conduct that I'm not talking about Philadelphia, which is like a sentimental story that sees the humanity in gay people, but movies that, a lot of movies that Miramax came out with that had S&M dynamics, had dynamics of cruelty, and that in the hinterlands or in the heartland, you just didn't watch those movies and feel like there was something in it for you that was good, And then you were finding that your own shudder that you had toward those things was being vilified as like racism or bigotry or corniness or puritanism or provincialism. And I can imagine those two responses, my shuddering feeling, the uncanny response of, former Republicans or Republicans who turned to MAGA, they those two responses were a response to something that was rotten in the state of Denmark. And one thing we might, as people who like abstractions, refer to that thing as is neoliberalism, right? Or you say econometrics, and a consolidation of the ruling class, the proliferation of billionaires and monopolization of capital. That's how we might, in boring terms, explain what happened with Epstein. Then there is a much more exciting story that thrives in QAnon, most of which is not true, but a fragment of which is freaking true, right? It's like Jeffrey Epstein at these crazy islands was like, it's a little like, we don't like to think that the Russian, like, it's very immature or something to say, well, Russian collusion doesn't happen because, Putin comes up to Trump and is like, here's your tape of you having sex in the Ritz or whatever. Nothing really happens like that. But Epstein did happen like that. And it is one way, I think, the fact that most of us, at least on the left, thought the Epstein thing was put to rest, thought that it was like Ground by the Pussy or the rape of Eugene Carroll, and it was just another Teflon thing that would roll off Trump. Moreover, I, until very recently, thought, well, come on, there's never been a real suggestion that he had sex with a teenager, with an underage person, but there is. And so I feel in some ways that there's a listening to QAnon part of this, which is like, they were sensing that something was really, really weird. And, incest and what they call age discrepant relationships, or the rape of kids, is very common in lots of institutions, from the Catholic Church to the Boy Scouts and so on. And they weren't wrong. Yeah. They weren't wrong. We all had a creepy feeling, and now we have a name for that creepy feeling. And Jeffrey Epstein is a much more vivid name than neoliberalism.
Yeah. Well, and your point about that creepy sensation that a lot of the QAnon people had. I wrote recently a piece of just looking at the numbers that, right-wing religious communities are disproportionately plagued by child abuse compared to other communities. And somebody went and did the stats on just like actual cases of people accused of child sexual abuse. And what they found was that so she went and gathered literally more than 10,000 cases between a year span. Mm-hmm. And what she found was that of politicians who had been accused of that type of crime, that it was 67% of them were Republicans.
Wow.
And that 1.7, I think, 2.2% or something like that were libertarians, which when you think of how few elected libertarians there are in this country, that's astronomically overrepresented that party is. And so
that is amazing. Go ahead.
And the same thing is true that when you just look at abuse studies, that these far right religious denominations, the leaders that operate them they have unquestioned authority,
right?
And people are not allowed to examine them. They don't provide accountability, and they often have completely they don't do background checks on people, because they feel that the Lord tells them they should hire this person, and so they do, and don't bother to check whether they have had convictions or whatnot. And so this is why all of the biggest abuse scandals that have happened have been in the theologically conservative denominations.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that we have to, one of Trump's, one of the biggest, he said to not call things Trump does missteps, because sometimes he's right on sure-footed right when he looks like he's stepping outside. But I think calling the Jeffrey Epstein affair and all of it, the crimes, a hoax akin to the Russia hoax, which also was not a hoax, but the Epstein thing a hoax, is saying, well, it all didn't exist, right? Like, Bill Clinton denied knowing what Epstein was doing and denied being a part of it. Trump has not issued a denial. He doesn't deny a lot of things. He mostly just says it's all a hoax, right? Like that he never met Eugene Carroll. And so he usually he doesn't mount a factual defense. He just says this is all just didn't happen, or it's just not true. Like Brett Kavanaugh did with Christine Blasey Ford. And parenthetically, I would love it if we got, speaking of empiricism, just one person who said, yeah, I didn't really know much about sex. I'm Brett Kavanaugh. I was drunk. I don't know anything. And I tried to take off this woman's clothes and she had a swimsuit on and got over ahead of my skis, and we've all done it. And I'm so sorry to her. And I'm so sorry I affected you. And now here's my history of understanding the Constitution. And I'd like to be on the Supreme Court. I think most sane people would say, you know what? That thing sounds like it happened. And the only thing that's making me crazy about you is that you just say it didn't, you've just like obliterated it. You've just said it didn't happen. And I do think because we know that Jeffrey Epstein was friends with Donald Trump, that there's photographic evidence, that there's witnesses, we know that they were very close. And because we know that Jeffrey Epstein committed a lot of crimes, and this is all just, nobody right or left disagrees with any of this. I've never heard anyone try to say that it was a hoax. So to tell us that it's a hoax is to do, what Joe Rogan has said, what a lot of people on the right have said, is just to gaslight the shit out of us. And this is a time where we're not having it. And yeah. I think that is a really interesting, finally, at least, there's one example, maybe fleeting, of a time that, Trump told us to disbelieve the evidence of our eyes, that, it was a hoax, like crop circles. Like I was thinking of things that hoax was used before, right? Like War of the Worlds, that it was like something perpetuated to do by whatever, that this isn't an abstract issue like that. This isn't a complex issue with the word hoax in it that makes you do triple cognitive epistemological backflips to understand that what each photo is a CGI photo, like all the things you'd have to do to imagine it's a hoax. We just don't want to rev up to do that again. Right now, no. We want to just be there and say, you know what? Raping girls, teenage girls, is wrong. And I know it in my bones it's wrong. The fact that it is common, and in families we know it's common, we can't pretend that this is not a huge thread in human history. I mean, there's so many disturbing numbers on this, including the ones you just gave, but you probably saw that in England, God, I don't want to get this wrong, but there's some enormous number of people that are descendant from first-degree incest. And, whose father, whose grandmother and great-grandfather, whatever, had sex with each other. And this is, this is a phenomenon that we can't deny, either because we want to keep our heads in the sand or because we're party to it, like the Catholic Church, like the Boy Scouts, like Jeffrey Epstein, like Mike Jeffries, who used to run Abercrombie and Fitch. We can't, they might say this doesn't exist because they want to call the whole thing a hoax. And the rest of us who don't have those kind of relationships in our lives might want to say it doesn't exist because it doesn't exist for us. And it's too horrible to think that it does. But the truth is, it's just incredibly common. And Jeffrey Epstein did it. And, I don't know if I want to call it systemic, but I think the numbers are there. The complicity is there. And it, in some ways, it's incredibly satisfying to finally have an example of cruelty that we can all agree is cruelty and that we can all oppose. I thought the murders in Newtown of toddlers were an example of cruelty that we should do everything we could to prevent from happening ever again. Somehow, the right did not think that. And they think that the, expansion of rights for trans people or even expansion of medical care for trans people represents some kind of cruelty. I don't see it as cruelty. So I was starting to despair that we could agree on an idea of what is something, the strong attacking the weak, deliberately causing suffering, that we could agree that we collectively need to oppose. Right? We don't even need to agree on any moral principles. We just need to agree on what a cruel act is that we see. And it's just very, very satisfying to see this brief coalition between people on the left and people on the right, that Trump's participation in the sort of Epstein machine is beyond the pale.
Yeah, I think so. And it also cuts across what, these cross ideological understandings have become a lot more difficult because society has really transitioned into kind of fictionalized versions of itself, that everybody's developed their own version of it. So like there's a famous evangelical book called This Present Darkness, and it's a novel about a small town that is being that demons are trying to gain possession of it through working with universities, possessed universities, and a small town pastor that fights against it. And it's a fictionalization, and I bought a copy of it from a used bookstore, and it's fascinating that it was because I like buying physical used copies of books because you can see what previous readers thought about them. And the reader of this book had inscribed it as a gift to someone else, and it said something like, "This book is fiction, but the ideas behind it are all real."
Amazing. Wow.
Yeah. And like, and this type of, a hermeneutic of reality, is what a lot of people have. And, I think everybody probably to some degree, we all have this, going back to the idea of interpretation, as reality or not. But it became much more of a thing beginning with the popularization of, mass fiction.
Yes.
So like C.S. Lewis or Tolkien, and The Matrix, that everybody thinks in terms of, well, maybe not everybody, but like a lot of people really do see reality in these metaphoric terms. And Peter Thiel, to circle back with him, he names all of his companies after, Lord of the Rings things.
It's amazing.
Like Palantir.
Yes.
And, and that guy, Curtis Yarvin, the reactionary blogger, he sees himself as a dark elf, and people who agree with him.
Yes. I mean, they are living in something that looks like Middle Earth or Resident Evil, 25 or Endless Runner games like Elon Musk. And, I think you would know better than I do that like worlds of demons, Satan, Antichrists that, have driven people in various panics in the past. That there were so many in the madness of crowds, right? Like that almost all of those are driven by panics about obscure forces, and mostly they're mapped onto Christian iconography. And Milton, obviously, like a huge influence on American life was Milton and Milton's Satan. So one of the other ways that we started by talking about politics for English majors, the fact that these texts, and I'm so glad you mentioned This Present Darkness. I hadn't heard of that one, but they're, the Scientology, foundational Scientology books like Battlefield Earth, the Turner Diaries is a work of fiction. Ayn Rand, who's always treated as a philosopher, is in fact an author of fiction. If you've read The Fountainhead, if you've read Atlas Shrugged, you've read a novel, right? And a novel by, and you may have thought, because it's very unlikely that you read it for the characters, the irony, the metaphors, even the plot, you come away believing the ideas are real. And you may come away believe, like you're an inscriber of that book, and you may come away believing that you read a work of philosophy or allegory. And this is where the tools of literary criticism come in. And I'm just going to keep one thing succinct. People do not need to learn to fact check or understand facts. They need to learn to read fiction as fiction, which is what literary critics teach you to do. So that's where the English major is useful. There is a beautiful state of mind, and some people interacting with AI understand this, of willingly suspending disbelief and getting into this kind of trance where you're living with characters. People know it much better now from bingeable Netflix series. What are you doing when you watch a really cool detective series on Netflix, or you watch The Succession on HBO? You're watching forged history. You're watching people that kind of act like real people, but they speak in heightened language and things happen to them that don't happen to real people. And anyone with a gift who grew up reading novels, not allegories like the ones that we're talking about, but real novels with ironies and humor and fiction and characters that are aestheticized and created, know when you're in the presence of art and take it in this wonderful way. I mean, a great Netflix series or a great, or Succession has this wonderful effect on the brain. I mean, the willing suspension of disbelief is like, that's Coleridge's term, is a trance. You're not believing, right? You're not believing what you read. That would be like reading Pizzagate and taking a gun and trying to find the people that are responsible for it. That's, you believe what you read. You read it like, oh, I'm, a thing happened in the world and I'm going to avenge people by taking out a gun. And again, parenthetically, there have always been people who mistakenly read like that. The Stephen King novel Misery, right? There's a reader, the Kathy Bates character in the movie, who believes that Misery, the central character in a novel, is real and she must redeem her. And so she takes the author prisoner, hostage. There are people who believe Dickens's characters were real, notoriously wept when little Nell died. But taking a novel as real means that you have not acquired the incredibly pleasurable capacity to get into the fiction trance. And
well, it's catharsis, as Aristotle called it.
Yeah. We'll say more about that. You mean in the presence of, in his case, right, theater and poetry.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's still the same concept, that it is art. It is inhabiting a fictional moment as a heightened representation of reality.
Yeah.
That it's not just, it isn't a pale imitation. In fact, it is a exploration, a zoomed in a way that you can never get from observing real reality, because you have to inhabit your own mind. But
that's right.
With literature, we get to inhabit the mind of multiple people in the same story.
Yes. So that's where allegory comes in. And another feature of literary criticism is to help you understand genre. Allegory has a one-to-one correspondence between characters and places and ideas in the world. And many of the books that drive people are simple allegories. Pilgrim's Progress, the kind of ect allegory in English, was on people's beds next to the Bible, and taking literally the idea that a character, called Everyman, was a person who then faced certain temptations that were like the slough of despond he had to get through. And this is true in Dante also, but that he had to face down with Vanity Fair is another example, and resist these temptations and make his way through the thickets of seductions in order to be godly. Read an allegory like that, and there's like a key at the bottom. I mean, these are the kind of things, by the way, the reading that's taught by homeschooling, that misses irony and metaphor. I'll just put it that simply. And so if I were going to teach anything, it would be how to read fiction as fiction. What's great about reading fiction as opposed to fact-checking, which I've also done for a living, is fact-checking is incredibly tedious. It's pedantic. It's librarian. Nobody likes to be corrected. Reading fiction as fiction is an absolute delight. And it's a way to be like, oh, I see. I know when I'm drinking a glass of wine versus, drinking a refreshing glass of water. And I don't mistake one for the other. I don't think that I should seek hydration, nourishment, whatever, in this glass of wine that I might seek in a green smoothie or whatever. And that's true with fiction too. That it's not quite clear. It may give us catharsis. It may give us pleasure. It may give us better ways of understanding the world. It may give us, and this is what Rorty thought, better ways of understanding ourselves. Because the metaphor, the idiosyncratic metaphoric, as he tediously said, that existed in great literature, There's nothing like it for crystallizing a person's sense of identity and what dies when they die, and what dies when we die. At least I found that to be true. And a lot of things are included in literature there, of course. I certainly count television and scraps of thinking on the internet and epigrams from philosophy and all those things.
Just to go back to Rorty as we're coming up on the hour here
Yeah.
in our recording, that he wrote a book. His final book was called "Achieving Our Country," and it was a really good book in a lot of ways. And I wish that more people had read it in the late '90s when it came out, because he was trying to. It was, I mean, in many ways, a prophetic warning to the left about you have to be able to speak in something other than abstractions.
Mm-hmm.
You have to understand that the truth is something that is felt and always in motion, and that everyone has to be included in it, and that their needs are also part of what truth is, and answering them and providing for them. And that was ignored by neoliberalism. And, but he also talked about trying to make sure of avoiding two different types of dangers, that movements that are trying to do achieve social change. You want to talk about those?
Yeah, I really would love to. I mean, this is a pressing interest of mine in my podcast with Stephen Metcalf called, I'll just plug it, What Rough Beast. Stephen and I both studied with Richard Rorty at the University of Virginia. That's how we met. And his kind of pragmatism, his version of pragmatism, was revelatory, I think, to both of us. And one of the points that he makes in this essay, he includes in Achieving Our Country, an essay he wrote for Dissent in the 90s called Movements and Campaigns, which is very short and succinct, and I think gets at something extremely important. Now, Rorty was disliked on the right and the left in his time equally, but he definitely, that does not mean that he objected to the left more than the right. He thought that the pull that the right, so let's just call it fascism, has on us is tragic. The pull that some of the worst tendencies of the left has on us, he called a nuisance, which I think is a very good distinction when you hear complaints about wokery, right? It's like, someone, when Trump was first elected, someone on my Facebook page said, better nuclear winter than more letters in LGBTQ, right? And it had really gotten so that the nuisance of left-wing, speech codes or kind of efforts to be accommodating, or maybe they were, it was small bits of pedantry, were driving people into the hands of like exterminationist fascism, right? That they'd rather die than, participate in this kind of nuisance ritual. And we can't mistake the nuisances from what's now called the woke or formerly politically correct. We can't mistake those for tragedy and run from them into the hands of fascism. It would just be it's a terrible category error to think of them as equally terrible. However, he does talk about the problem with what he calls movements. So movements mostly revolutionary, and movements that are extremely focused on utopia and focused on a moment that never comes. So the kingdom of God, or the apotheosis of the worker. Anything that you might have, the 1,000-Year Reich, anything you might have heard that's on a, extraordinarily long timeline and far in the future, a moment that never comes, and a moment that we can never fully realize. Like there are no, as they would say in business, there are no deliverables. There's no, what is a KPI? Key product indicator, no key progress indicator. I don't know. There's nothing you could put up on your deck for venture when you're, trying to get venture capital and say, well, we've realized this, right? Campaigns and so movements, as we were talking about earlier, devolve very quickly into two terrible problems. One is infighting and purges. So like Stalinish purges or Maoist struggle sessions, to choose to, on the would-be left. But also separation of rhinos from MAGA, right? Like rhinos or regular Republicans and MAGA Republicans might vote alike on 80% of subjects. But if you read, as I just did, Kristi Noem's book about politics, she's so far right that the people that are really in her sights are like Paul Ryan, you know? And she would probably do well to align with Paul Ryan since most of their politics are the same. But her hatred for him is very like the hatred on the left for, say, the people that quarreled in the Women's March, which were kind of pro-Palestine and pro-Israel feminists. And, that thing fell apart because of this kind of infighting and desire for purity tests and to purge people who didn't agree with you on everything. Now, that is something that the left is often faulted for, because we come up with a lot of infighting because we're trying to have a big tent, because a lot of people are included among, say, Democrats, a lot of different people with different backgrounds. But that kind of infighting is definitely present on the right. And, it happens in primaries. And, the first fights that Trump picked were with, Jeb Bush. So the idea that they didn't even share a set of values because Trump had to be a movement. He had to be like a one man, and I don't necessarily want to say cult leader, but cults also style themselves as movements that were moving toward the promised land. Okay, the promised land almost always in the infighting falls away. So you think of like David Koresh, right, at Waco. He originally had some idea of a movement toward a kind of socialist, multiracial something world. But pretty soon, he was amassing guns, and the federal government didn't like that he had guns, and he had much younger girlfriends, and that was against the law of the land. And then the whole thing became a late stage cult where it's just about fighting against either people on the inside who aren't sufficiently committed or people on the outside who are trying to get you for something. And you've lost sight of this utopia that you first drew people in with. So movements, they lose their utopias and they devolve into infighting. But the last thing that happens is that they commit cruelty. Because if what you're interested in is the rapture, this is sort of your territory, but the rapture, the restoration of the kingdom of God on earth, if what you are interested in those things, that if those are the things that motivate you, then anything can be justified in their name. And those things often turn out to be cruelty. So one thing Richard Rorty says is any summum bonum, any ultimate good can be cited to by Nazis or by Maoists to justify violence. So hope, or even, I have trouble even with decency and kindness, even sort of the mild ones. But because his argument was anything that you and I agree on at the philosophy table that is like the ultimate good, truth, right? You can imagine a Nazi or a Maoist torturing someone saying, I'm doing this in the name of truth. So, as Rorty says, the thing that we oppose, we don't have an ultimate good as pragmatists, but we have an ultimate evil. And that ultimate evil is not the Antichrist, it's not the orcs, it's not Sauron, it's not something from fiction, it's cruelty. It's the infliction of suffering on people, on people, and the fear that kind of cruelty, so let's take the ICE arrests, engenders in people. So we know cruelty when we see it. That's what I think is useful about Jeffrey Epstein. Why do we oppose cruelty? Why do we behave humanely? Just because. We don't derive it from some truth. There are probably efforts. Once you start with truth, you can derive cruel actions. So you have to oppose the action at the end of it. And that's how you get people to do things to change the world. So I was in a seminar with him and someone said, well, we would never have gotten desegregation without Christianity because King was a Christian and because I have a dream cited Christian, used Christian tropes, and that people wouldn't have been moved to do it. And Richard Rorty said very memorably, "I wish it weren't that way." Right? It's just like, I wish that you did not have to have some doctrine. Then someone else raised their hand and said, I find as a feminist that the kind of thinking around the gaze of the other, which was the kind of French feminist theory that was soaking up our minds at the time, I find that thinking around the gaze of the other, around the male gaze, to be incredibly motivating. And Rorty said, well, what does it motivate you to do? And she said, well, really understand this and that. And he said, but how are you eliminating cruelty or promoting human flourishing? There are a shortage of, this is the 90s, beds for female AIDS patients right now. This is the kind of campaign that we could all be part of. And, you know, I asked, after the fires in Portland, Oregon, I asked a friend, this was a couple of years ago, like I had read something about someone opening his door from the inside and scalding his hand on his doorknob from the inside and getting blisters and burns. And I said, how could I help someone like that? You know, I just want to cool off his body and get him some Neosporin. And she said, well, oppose climate disinformation. And I just thought, I think that ship has sailed, right? I don't want a movement about saving the earth right now. I really want to get this guy some bottles of water and some Neosporin for his hand and some burn treatments and a bandage. And those kind of campaigns are the kind of thing Rorty really appreciated. And there's a wonderful list in Movements and Campaigns of the campaigns that he had thought were extremely successful. And you can name tons of them in this country, including reducing emissions, and a lot of the things, by the way, that Trump is undoing. But campaigns that have made the world better, public education. And it's measurable, right? So you have a theory of change, but you can't have a theory of change without these indicators of progress, markers of progress toward your change. And some of those markers are the ones realized by campaigns. The most recent one I participated in was the Tesla takedown, where the idea was to stigmatize driving a Tesla. It's gadfly-ish. Nobody likes it. It's annoying. We were yelling at Tesla drivers outside dealerships that like, shame, shame, sell, sell, sell. And in this country, sales went down and the stock price dropped. And ultimately, Musk was so troubled by it that the Tesla takedowns were included in dangers to the stock and got people to downgrade the stock because, as an insurance question, the fact that its reputation was taking a hit from protesters explicitly was affecting the value of the company. And he left the government in part to restore the Tesla stock price. So it was a very, very effective campaign. And he was like, the cruelty that was, that we were opposing was his attack on USAID. He put it in the wood chipper, and that put children in the wood chipper. So there was something wonderful about that campaign. Was it, yes, we can? Did it have a charismatic leader standing up there and getting us to cathect on him and love him and imagine that there's some magic future? It did not. What it had was us yelling at car drivers so that they would finally decide it was too much of a drag to drive a Tesla. They weren't as cool as he thought. People were going to slap incel inside stickers on it, and why not buy another kind of car? And so that's an example of a campaign being successful. And I have a hard time thinking of a movement that has ever been successful, and have a very easy time of thinking of movements like the French Revolution or Maoism that turned quite cruel and bloody.
Yeah. Well, and I would say further that, the idea of countering this tragic, hateful, political philosophy of Trumpism, it has to be done in this way of preventing cruelty and in letting people know that they do have a future, even if they have these, antiquated, superstitious beliefs that letting them know nobody's going to make you disbelieve those things.
Yeah.
You can, if you want to believe these false beliefs, go ahead. We're
Right.
not going to stop you.
That's right.
You just can't impose them on everyone else. And
Yeah.
you should be okay with that.
Yeah. The one last thing I'll say about literary criticism, which is obviously a passion, is that there was a wonderful book by Janice Radway called Reading the Romance from the 80s. And it did a lot in literary criticism, but the main thing it did for me was propose a reason that people believe lies and that they read compulsively. And for romance readers in the 80s, the books really rewarded someone who reads like a detective. So because the story was a man behaving cruelly to you, this is also the plot of Pride and Prejudice, actually loves you more than anyone, right? So you're like writing away the current abuse and cruelty in your head all the time in this incredibly pleasurable way. And, in Pride and Prejudice, Mr. Darcy is like, withholding and snobbish and terrible and imperious. But then it turns out that's the greatest love of all. And to make your life bearable while your husband is ignoring you, putting up a shield of a book. Sometimes these women were reading 3-4 books a day. They were reading the way people read the internet now. Just compulsive. Tell yourself a story over and over again. So, you're, a single man, as they always say, living in your mother's basement, but reading these things, you are actually Luke Skywalker, or you're actually, Legolas, or a wonderful hero, or you're on the video games believing that, because it ends up being, at least in the case of the romance readers, your heart breaks because they're just as bruised. This was a group of people, women in the Midwest, who identified as housewives and were reading these novels. You're just as bruised, or, just as single or just as lonely as you ever were, but you've decided to devise a story in your head that tells it otherwise, that redefines everything you're seeing as proof of your glory. And I don't know. I shouldn't say that I think that's necessarily tragic, although that's a use it can be put to. I mean, right? We all should read fiction that rewards readers. Like the reader is the hero who sees things as not quite as they are. I mean, that's why I think we like detective stories so much. But and I don't want to deny people their pleasures or say like, well, you always have to just face the fact that the world is hitting you in the face and that you're not that cool guy in the video game. I don't know what to say about that. I just think that, to kind of conclude on something to do with literary criticism, reading fiction as fiction is not just a pleasurable thing to do. It is an incredibly useful epistemological thing to do, because you will be drawn to fiction anyway. And not deciding that it is fact, not deciding you should take your marching orders from J.R.R. Tolkien, but that and that you're going to make the world better if you even read Joseph Campbell's Hero's Journey. You are, let's face it, not Odysseus. You are not on a hero's journey. You are trying to live your life. That does not mean you don't read the Odyssey, but you read it as fiction. And there are some wonderful tools from literary criticism that will help you understand how to read fiction as fiction.
So, Virginia, for people who want to keep up with all of your things, tell us your recommendations.
You mean where you can find me, or what I'm reading?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Where you can find me is almost everything I write washes up sometime on my Substack, which is virginiaheffernan.substack.com. It's called Magic and Loss, but the link is virginiaheffernan.substack.com. And I also write quite regularly for the New Republic. So check in on the New Republic. I'm in there about once a week, and I think I have a big piece out this week on the Big Ten conference. And the last place you can find me is anywhere you get your podcasts. What Rough Beast is the name of the show. What Rough Beast. It's Stephen Metcalf and me talk to an extraordinary, interesting range of guests about everything from the IRA to Jeffrey Epstein to ICE, and the guests are great. So just to plug it, What Rough Beast, and that is always free. It was paywalled once or twice in the very beginning, but it's always free. And there's free content on the Substack too. You can also get a free trial, and so that's it. What Rough Beast. virginiaheffernan.substack.com and The New Republic.
All right. Sounds good. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much.
All right, so that is the program for today. I appreciate you joining us for the conversation. And you can always get more if you go to theoryofchange.show, where we have the video, audio, and transcript of all the episodes. And if you are a paid subscribing member to Flux, you can get unlimited access to the archives. So go to patreon.com/discoverflux if you want to do it on the Patreon side, or you can go to flux.community if you want to subscribe on Substack. So, and if you're watching on YouTube, please do click the like and subscribe button so you can get notified whenever there's a new episode. And that will do it. Thanks a lot for joining us. I'll see you next time.